positives for the Muslim plaintiffs. By editorial. November 11, 2019, 4:24 p.m. The judgment in the hotly contested property dispute of Ayodhya has finally been delivered by a 5-judge Supreme Court bench. Though our judges do take an oath to decide on cases without fear or favor, in what looks to be an unprecedented act, the judge who authored this verdict preferred not to reveal his name. Even the author of the 116-page addendum has strangely kept his name secret. Though the apex court accepted that a wrong had been done when the Babri Masjid was desecrated in 1949 through installation of idols and also held that the demolition of the mosque in 1992 was illegal, in the final order, it had to give the entire disputed site to the Hindu plaintiffs, though law of equity says that one who seeks equity must come with clean hands. Peace and tranquility. In paragraph 799, the court explicitly said that, even as a matter of maintaining public peace and tranquility, the solution which commended itself to the Allahabad High Court division of the property into 3 parts is not feasible. The disputed site measures all of 1,500 square yards. Dividing the land will not subserve the interest of either of the parties or secure a lasting sense of peace and tranquility. This was, thus, the central concern of the court in this historic dispute. The defenders of the rule of law, minority rights and secularism in general and Muslims in particular need not feel disappointed with this judgment, though it is true that the court, after correctly spelling out the law, wrongly applied them to facts. Here, we will examine the several positive findings and observations of the court that must be welcomed and appreciated, which will help us retain our otherwise shaken confidence in the majesty of law. Since there is worry about the Vishwa Hindu Parishad (VHP's) claim in respect of 3,000 other mosques, the court yet again reiterated that secularism is part of the basic structure of the Constitution and that the Places of Worship Act 1991 protects and secures fundamental values of the Constitution. It went on to say that the Places of Worship Act imposes a non-derogable obligation towards enforcing our commitment to secularism under Indian Constitution. The Act is thus a legislative intervention which preserves non-retrogression as an essential feature of our secular values. This assurance by the court must put all apprehensions to rest. Second, on the topic of freedom of religion under Article 25, the court categorically made a highly appreciable observation that we must firmly reject any attempt to lead the court to interpret religious doctrine in an absolute and extreme form and question the faith of worshippers. Nothing would be as destructive of the values underlying Article 25. Accordingly, the argument put forward by some Hindus that the Babri Masjid as per Islamic theology was not a legitimate mosque was rejected. Faith is a matter for the individual believer, said the court. Third, the court accepted the Sunni Waqf board's plea that the place of Lord Ram's birth is not in itself a juristic person. This is a major setback to the Ram Lalla suit and will, in fact, avoid several future religious conflicts. The court said that conferral of such a right will impinge on the rights of people of other faiths. In para 201, the court observed that the purpose for which juristic personality is conferred cannot be evolved into a Trojan horse that permits, on the basis of religious faith and belief, the extinguishing of all competing proprietary claims over property. It said that a method of offering worship unique to one religion cannot result in conferral of an absolute title. In other words, the court made it clear that it could not accord primacy of one faith over others. This should really be music to the ears of proponents of multiculturalism who are every day feeling the heat of aggressive majoritarianism. Fourth, the court categorically accepted the central argument of the Muslim plaintiffs that the mosque was not constructed after the demolition of a Ram temple. The court has also said that the Archaeological Survey of India (ASI's) report had not found any evidence of demolition of a temple to construct the mosque. It pointed out that the ASI's findings had an intervening gap of 4 centuries. Thus, the Hindu rights primary narrative has been clearly rejected. No evidence on pillars. Fifth, the court also said that as per the ASI report, remnants of a pre-existing structure were not used for the construction of the mosque. Interestingly, even about the black Kasauti stone pillars, the court held that ASI in fact found no evidence to show that the pillars were relatable to the underlying pillar bases found during the excavation. Sixth, the argument of the Muslim plaintiffs that a title cannot be decided solely on the basis of faith or archaeological findings too has been accepted, and this is not a small victory and will be of great use in future disputes. 7th, the Muslim plaintiff's argument that title of property cannot be decided on the basis of travelers' accounts was also accepted, and the court rightly said that some portions of these accounts, including one by the 18th century Austrian missionary, Joseph Tiefenthaler, were based on hearsay. Ideally, the court should have totally rejected Tiefenthaler's writings, which have many inaccurate descriptions. Even about the Babri Mosque, he said that Aurangzeb constructed it. 8th, the court also accepted that there is no historical record prior to the 18th century that talked of the demolition of a Ram temple prior to the construction of the Babri Mosque. The court noted the evidence of Hindu witnesses who testified that there is no mention of Ram's birthplace either in Valmiki's Ramayana or Tulsidas's Ramcharitmanas. This seems to be the most controversial part of the verdict, as the court used freedom of religious faith to uphold the Hindu case when it said that whether a belief is justified lies beyond the ken of judicial scrutiny. It went on to hold that once the witnesses have deposed to the basis of the belief and there is nothing to doubt its genuineness, it is not open to the court to question the basis of belief. Scriptural interpretations are susceptible to a multitude of inferences. The court would do well not to step into the pulpit by adjudging which, if any, of competing interpretations should be accepted. But did not this very court interpret Quran on maintenance in the Shah Bano case, 1985, and on triple divorce in the Shiara Bano case, 2017? Did it not reject the Hanafi interpretation? Finally, since the Muslim plaintiffs did not claim title in this case, they should be not mind the final outcome. The relief sought by them was just about the delivery of possession. Since the court did accept that they were wrongly deprived of their possession in 1949, ideally they should have been given possession of the inner courtyard rather than 5 acres of land elsewhere. Thereafter, the court would have been justified in invoking Article 142 to give the site to Hindus, or it may have asked Muslims to give up this land. A missed opportunity in Ayodhya. By Editorial. November 11, 2019, 2:13 p.m. It was never a legal dispute. It was a political dispute that became a social contestation that then landed up in the courts as a dispute over a plot of land. Yes, it was a legal dispute even in the 1880s, but it became the Ram Janmabhoomi movement of the 1980s because it was all about ascendant Hinduism seeking to place its imprint on a constitutional republic. Yet, ever since the Supreme Court in 1994 overruled the central government's decision to let all previous suits abate, we knew that whatever the political attempts to settle the dispute, it was the courts, ultimately the Supreme Court, that would have the last say. The essence of the judgment. The Supreme Court then had the opportunity to deliver a landmark judgment which, even if mindful of the social forces swirling around it, would uphold constitutional principles and affirm that India is a country where all citizens, irrespective of their faith, are equal citizens. What the Supreme Court has instead done is given a legal imprimatur to the triumph of the political and social forces that claim to speak on behalf of Hinduism. In less than 48 hours, the judgment has been analyzed in a threadbare fashion and its weak foundations have already been revealed. For instance, in this paper, Unimpeded Right in Outer Courtyard Wins Whole Site for Hindus, by K. Venkataramanan, November 10, 2019. The essence of the 1,045-page judgment is that the Hindu devotees had complete right to worship in the outer courtyard of the Babri Masjid since 1858, while the Muslims' right to pray in the inner courtyard has been contested. Therefore, possession of the entire disputed plot goes to the Hindus, for a temple to be built by a trust constituted by the government, no less. You do not have to be a legal person to be embarrassed on reading such a ruling. True, the ruling does in its own way try to achieve a balance and argues that the relief should be molded in a manner which preserves the constitutional values of justice, fraternity, human dignity, and the equality of religious belief. Towards this end, the verdict says that there is no evidence that the Babri Masjid had been built by destroying a temple, that the events of 1934, 1949 and 1992 constitute a serious violation of the law, and awards the Muslims 5 acres of land, almost double, mind you, of the size of the disputed plot elsewhere in Ayodhya to build a mosque. Dignity irrespective of faith. But is this in keeping with constitutional values, and does it ensure human dignity to all citizens, irrespective of their faith, as the Supreme Court said it must do? At a time when the institutions of electoral democracy have been considerably weakened and when the opposition is too weak to keep a powerful executive in check, you would expect the Supreme Court in particular to be the final custodian of constitutional values. But courts admittedly do not function in a vacuum. When there is a powerful majority in Parliament, they are usually circumspect. One would expect that in such a circumscribed setting the Supreme Court would make an extra effort to deliver an imaginative verdict that provides dignity and protection even if within a compromise resolution of a title suit. Yet, even as the court in its verdict draws on Article 142 of the Constitution, which gives it the power to deliver complete justice, it does so for minor reasons and not to give relief to the Muslim community. If the Supreme Court was going to decide to give possession of the disputed land to a trust for constructing a Ram temple, it could have used this particular article of the Constitution to draw a line under any other disputes over ancient mosques. That could have spared the country future communal mobilizations in Kashi and Mathura and affirmed to the Muslims that at least in the future, no vandalism of places of worship would be tolerated. This was, as reported in the press, a core clause of the settlement that most of the parties to the dispute had signed on under the Supreme Court-appointed mediation panel. The court refused to go down that path. Ominously, a few Hindu political groups have already said that there will not be any agitation for those sites, but only for now. The Supreme Court then did not turn the title suit into an opportunity and draw on Article 142 of the Constitution to deliver a verdict that would have shown its refusal to tolerate assaults on constitutional values. It instead stuck to the title suit and thereto interpreted the claims in a fashion. For the citizen, the message of the verdict may well be that in the end lawlessness can sometimes succeed. It may take time, it may mean lives lost, but ultimately if you maintain pressure and you raise tensions for a long period and politically mobilize around a demand, you will get what you want. How do we now prevent such a message from going out? The Ram Janmabhoomi movement was at its most violent 3 decades ago. A weariness had since set in and many on all sides just wished that the Masjid Mandir issue could be put behind us. The larger project of denying that people of all faiths enjoy equal rights under the Constitution is now nearing completion. The Ram Janmabhoomi was merely the late 20th century instrument for realizing this project. It has served its purpose, whatever may be said of egregious violations of the law and court orders. Contrary to the court's desire to give relief in the Ayodhya verdict in a manner that preserves constitutional values, the citizen could be forgiven for feeling that the opposite has happened. Impact on the Republic. The Supreme Court of the 1970s is now remembered for 2 contrasting judgments, the Kesavananda Bharati ruling, 1973, when it decreed that Parliament could not alter the basic structure of the Constitution, and the ADM Jabalpur ruling, 1976, when the court said that during a national emergency the citizen had no recourse to her fundamental rights. The first has given us protection against assaults on the Constitution, and the second has shown what should never again happen. 50 years from now, how will we remember the Ayodhya verdict? What impact is it going to have on the Republic? C. Ramanohar Reddy is editor of the India Forum. The story of Session and the EC is a striking example of the transformation an individual can achieve in a complex society with multiple levers of power. In retrospect, all that Session did was to enforce the authority of the EC as per its powers laid out in the Constitution. When the pushback came from the politicians, he stood his ground with the backing of the law. In clashes with the political class, his persona, aggressive, even abrasive, loomed larger than life, but it was the institution that ultimately won the battle. Session dusted off the model code of conduct and turned it into a powerful instrument to rein in political parties that were playing fast and loose with the rules of the game. The EC began to enforce campaign spending limits, and candidates were asked to submit accounts of poll expenses within a reasonable time limit. Cases were slapped on those who refused to comply. The EC also began to monitor the campaign process more closely by staggering elections and deploying a large number of poll observers and central forces. Violations of the model code were punished. Session's actions helped weaken the politician-bureaucrat cabal that was subverting the democratic process in large parts of the country and ended practices such as booth rigging and booth capturing widely prevalent in states like UP and Bihar. These reforms allowed the less privileged groups which had acquired a new political voice in the wake of Mandal to vote more freely. As Sai Qureshi, a former CEC, wrote in this newspaper, all his successor CECs basked in his glory, though we always carried the burden of being compared with him all the time. It is Session's lasting legacy that the bar has been raised for those who succeed him at the helm of the Election Commission. That would mean some big-ticket privatization, as during the Vajpayee-led NDA-1, not the sham divestment seen with ONGC, IOC or LIC being nudged to buy into other state-owned companies. A couple of big divestments, including ones which attract foreign firms like BPCL and Air India, could be game-changers in terms of enhancing competitiveness and efficiencies. Given the credibility deficit on fiscal accounting, it would be better for the government to be more transparent and account for all subsidies, including fertilizer, food and fuel on its own balance sheet. Financial markets and investors may take a fiscal slippage of 25 to 30 basis points or close to 4% in their stride as long as the budget figures and government accounting are transparent and credible. Alongside, the government must also make an effort to shed what is generally perceived to be its anti-business approach, which threatens to hurt industry. Former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh had rightly said 3 years ago that in a crisis, we act constructively and when it is over, status quo takes over. The bottom line is this: a government with a strong political mandate and which is still in the early days of its second term, can surely press the pedal on reforms. Treat the disease. By editorial. November 11, 2019, 2:54 p.m. There are, as there should be, severe legal consequences for those who sexually assault and target children under the POCSO Act. In matters of sexual crime and criminals, where there is an understandable social revulsion towards the perpetrators, the law tends to be blunt and the public discourse vitiated by a collective desire for revenge. While pedophilia has been classified by the World Health Organization as a disease, there are few mental health professionals in India equipped to deal with it. Over the last 5 years, though, that has been changing. As reported in this newspaper, over 300 people suspected of having pedophilic tendencies have reached out to a network of psychologists and psychiatrists based in Mumbai and Pune, seeking help. There are, as there should be, severe legal consequences for those who sexually assault and target children under the POCSO Act. But doctors at the Chem Hospital Research Center in Pune and the Chem Hospital in Mumbai attempt to treat pedophilia through counseling and antidepressants, especially those who are at the lower threshold of the disease and have not been booked under the Act. According to Klaus Bayer, director of the Institute of Sexology and Sexual Medicine in Berlin's Charité University, at least 1% of the male population suffers from pedophilia. Given India's population, that's too sizable a number to leave unaddressed and untreated. The initiative to open the door to those who want to deal with their pedophilic tendencies is welcome. Too often, the fear of the stigma that comes with articulating such feelings keeps them bottled up, leading to horrifying consequences. That a section of mental health professionals is taking a series of steps, from anonymous helplines to expanding the number of doctors capable of managing the disorder, to make a conversation possible is welcome. No society can leave the well-being of its children outside the ambit of the law, and once acts of sexual violence are committed, they must be prosecuted. But it is also important to deal with those who seek treatment before the worst happens, with compassion and sympathy. It is important to treat the disease, not merely punish the diseased. The idea of a Congress NCP-Sena coalition government is toxic. The NCP and Congress fought in alliance, and as Sharad Pawar said, got a mandate to sit in the opposition. Post-poll coalitions are a legitimate route to government formation when the legislature is hung, but the situation in Maharashtra is far from it. There were 2 pre-poll alliances, one got a clear majority and the other clearly lost. If the Congress and NCP want to keep the BJP out of power for ideological reasons, handing over power to a more virulent strain of Hindutva would be disingenuous. The formation of an NCP Congress-Sena government, whatever may be its facade, will not only be a betrayal of the mandate but also be indefensible in ideological terms besides being suicidal tactically. Such an alliance, if at all formed, would not be stable or sustainable. All these parties will be rightly blamed for being opportunistic and devoid of political convictions. The BJP will be the sole beneficiary of such a thorough delegitimization of the entire opposition spectrum in Maharashtra. In the inevitable mid-term election that will happen sooner rather than later, opportunists will pay a price. The Congress and the NCP would be better off losing this opportunity and leave the birds of the same feather to potentially flock together again. That said, it was inexcusable of the governor to not give the Sena or the NCP adequate time to explore the possibility of an alternative government. While a government without the BJP might lack moral or political legitimacy, the governor should have exhausted all avenues before recommending president's rule. The BJP must be hoping to pressure the Sena back into the alliance, but the best course now seems a fresh election. Mr. Morales came to power in 2006, riding South America's so-called pink tide, and promising economic development and equitable wealth distribution. Under his fairly good track record, Bolivia has seen a drop in extreme poverty, from 33% of the population in 2006 to 15% last year. His government also stepped up public investments, opened more schools and health clinics. The economy has also seen a steady growth rate. Mr. Morales made some major political mistakes as well. Primarily, he failed to bring up a second-rung leadership in the movement for socialism to whom he could pass the baton of his 21st century socialist revolution. In 2016, his push to end presidential term limits through a referendum failed. He then said he accepted the verdict. But later, a constitutional court lifted the term limits, allowing the president to seek re-election. This had galvanized the opposition, which claimed that the president's electoral participation itself was unconstitutional. This was followed by allegations of electoral fraud, which further weakened him. Facing protests, Mr. Morales had offered another election. That should have been the way forward. A free and fair election being held under the supervision of international electoral monitors would have allowed the Bolivians to choose their legitimate leader. But the violent protesters who insisted on Mr. Morales' resignation, the police forces who rebelled against the government, and finally the generals who forced the president to go all destroyed the possibility of a peaceful transition. They threw Bolivia into anarchy and chaos. And more violence could be awaiting the country. This Gandhian view did not stem from strategic considerations but was grounded in deep conviction. It is sometimes said that Gandhi's views were influenced by Jaina teachings. All religions are true and all have error, he said, implying that all religions are inevitably partial, incomplete, fragmentary, so that different traditions need to complement and enrich one another rather than behave as mutually exclusive rivals. Without denying this philosophical lineage, I would claim that Gandhi's views were shaped even more by the wisdom traditions of the ancient world, in which gods and goddesses of each cultural region are different, yet part of the same semantic universe and therefore mutually related and translatable. As a result, no culture denied the reality of the gods of another culture but always found ways to accommodate them. For instance, the god of another culture could become a member of the family, say, some other god's son, Ganesh the son of Shiva and Parvati. A new god could be created by merging half of one god and half of another, Harihara. Most of all, a relation of equivalence or identity could be established between them. Rudra is Shiva, making it possible to claim that the gods of different cultures were the same, only called by different names. Gandhi was inspired by these traditions, particularly by the habit of establishing equivalence, and extended this insight to the New World religions. Thus he claimed that Ram, Allah, Satya, truth, refer to the same entity. If this is so, every attack on someone else's god was a denial of one's own god, every claim that one's own god is better than the others was tantamount to the humiliation of one's own god. Yet the realizability of Gandhian secularism depends on faith in popular wisdom traditions, which in turn is sustained by a certain idea of popular moral agency. When good, God-loving, ordinary men and women free from the trappings of power, wealth and fame, precisely what makes them ordinary and good, get together, they release non-violent creative energies that morally sustain and improve our world. Alas, it seems that such men and women have gone missing in our times. Gandhian secularism is badly needed, but who will ride it out? Disqualified, yet qualified. By Editorial. November 13, 2019, 2:07 p.m. It is not often that an adverse order brings relief along with it. Even while upholding the Karnataka Speaker's orders disqualifying 17 defectors this year, the Supreme Court has allowed the former legislators to contest the December 5 by-elections to 15 assembly seats. The former Janata Dal, S, and Congress MLAs are now free not only to contest the polls but may reap the benefits of their amoral crossover by getting a ticket from the ruling BJP. Most of them had tried to resign from their respective parties in July, but the move was seen as a transparent ploy to bring down the JDS Congress regime of H.D. Kumaraswamy. The suspicion, not unfounded, was that they would get ministerial positions as soon as BJP leader B.S. Yediyurappa formed a BJP government. The then Speaker, K.R. Ramesh Kumar, kept them at bay for days by refusing to act on their resignations. Ultimately, he disqualified all of them in orders passed on July 25 and 28 and said the disqualification would go on till 2023, the end of the current Assembly's term. The Speaker's stance was quite controversial as it appeared to create a conflict between resignation and disqualification. He now stands partially vindicated as his argument that resignation could not be a ruse to evade an impending disqualification has been accepted. The Speaker was also hoping to keep the defectors out of any alternative regime as members disqualified for defection are barred from becoming ministers until they get re-elected. The court's exposition of the law relating to the interplay between resignation and defection is quite welcome. On the one hand, resignation does not take away the effect of a prior act that amounts to disqualification. On the other, speakers are not given a free pass to sit on resignation letters indefinitely. Under Article 193, a provision under which the Speaker has to ascertain the voluntary and genuine nature of a resignation before accepting it, the court is clear that it is a limited inquiry, only to see if the letter is authentic and if the intent to quit is based on free will. Once it is demonstrated that a member is willing to resign out of his free will, the Speaker has no option but to accept the resignation, the court has said. This effectively ends the argument that the Speaker is empowered to consider the motives and circumstances whenever a resignation is submitted. The verdict bemoans the fact that speakers sometimes tend not to be neutral, and that change of loyalty for the lure of office continues despite the anti-defection law. Identifying its weak aspects and strengthening the law may be the answer. Gloom deepens. By editorial. November 13, 2019, 2:08 p.m. Yet another set of economic data from the National Statistical Office has reaffirmed both the depth and all-pervasive width of the ongoing economic slowdown. The latest Index of Industrial Production, IIP, estimates from the NSO show that output shrank by 4.3% in September, with all three component sectors in the index, manufacturing, mining and electricity, posting contractions. This was the sharpest contraction in output since at least April 2012, before which the data was referenced to a different base year. Also, 5 of the 6 categories on the IIP's use-based classification of goods registered declines, with only intermediate goods bucking the trend. Disconcertingly, the prolonged slump in the output of capital goods, a proxy for investment activity by businesses, extended into a 9th straight month as production contracted by about 21% for the second month in a row. Consumer durables also posted a 4th straight contraction, with the 9.9% decline appearing in stark contrast to September 2018's 5.4% growth. Clearly, manufacturers of white goods are struggling to find demand for their wares, and the sliding production points to an absence of the traditional Festival Eve restocking bump. The second successive shrinkage in infrastructure and construction goods, it shrank 6.4%, reflects the challenges besetting the two eponymous primary sectors. Here, the center's announcement of a funding initiative to help stalled housing projects ought to provide some fillip in the coming months. But a stretched fiscal situation is likely to keep government spending on other big-ticket infrastructure projects muted for the foreseeable future. From an industry perspective, 17 of the 23 industry groups that comprise the manufacturing sector contracted. And leading the slump, predictably, was the motor vehicles industry, which posted a 25% contraction. If the wholesale data from the Society of Indian Automobile Manufacturers, SIAM, is any indicator of trends for this industry, there is certainly more pain ahead as overall shipments fell almost 13% from a year earlier in October. Demand for newly introduced utility vehicles was the saving grace, as it propelled a marginal uptick in passenger vehicle deliveries. SIAM's figures on commercial vehicles, which show a 23% year-on-year decline, particularly underscore the demand vacuum in the rural hinterland and the wariness on the part of fleet operators to invest in new haulage capacity. With manufacturing having a weight of almost 78% in the IIP, the latest report from IHS Markit gives little room for optimism. The survey-based Purchasing Managers Index revealed continuing manufacturing sector weakness in October as weakening demand hurt new orders and business sentiment. In fact, business confidence had slipped last month to its lowest level in more than 2.5 years, according to the private economic research group. All signs now point to the central bank cutting interest rates again at its next meeting, in order to help spur a revival. Information flow and identity. Also mystifying to all those seeking plausible answers to the Kashmir imbroglio is why, instead of indulging in such needless shenanigans of less than doubtful value, the government did not come out with a straightforward explanation of what it had sought and achieved by its actions. The deed-biz dilution of Article 370 and reducing the status of J and K into 2 union territories is a fait accompli. Single quote. What the government should do is to put out for the information of the people of J&K in India, as also the world at large, what plans it has for this troubled region in the period ahead. Together with affirmations of adherence to democratic protocol, this would meet with far greater resonance from the people than devious steps and tactics of the MEP variety. The authorities will need to prepare for some degree of violence once the measures put in place are relaxed. This situation would be far better, however, than to be accused of resorting to an authoritarian approach that further prolongation of the curfew and current harsh measures would entail. It is again important to remember that while special measures such as Article 370 and Article 35A can be removed from the statute books, there is another, and bigger, issue at stake, viz. That of Kashmiri identity, which cannot be erased. The latter would still require careful nurturing. Ignoring this and merely promising a bright economic future for the two Union territories would make it sound as hollow as the apologies made in the late 1930s to justify Stalinism's crimes during that period as the necessary price for building a socialist future. This is a time for healing, not for more confrontation. In Kashmir, what is needed today is a reassurance of democratic traditions rather than what cynics would refer to as a bubble, and a promise of vibrant economic opportunities while they worry about their freedoms. Kashmir is not a piece of software for experimentation. To keep repeating that Article 370 was responsible for all of Kashmir's ills is likely to have fewer and fewer takers as time elapses. What is needed is to dispel any notion that Delhi is accelerating colonization of everyday life in Kashmir. As a very first step, normalcy needs to be restored by removing most of the impediments that exist at present, with the release of political leaders and as many of their followers as possible. Democracy is at an inflection point today, and liberal democratic trends are in retreat in many regions of the globe. The common presumption is that erosion of democracy occurs when there is excessive concentration of powers in a single authority, accompanied by curbs on the media. Kashmir is today perceived as perilously close to this. It is for India's leaders to confound and confront their opponents by relaxing the measures in place. Today more than ever, India needs to underscore the importance of diversity, the dignity of individuals, and protection of their rights. It should be able to demonstrate necessary flexibility, the ability to deal with paradoxes, and manage seemingly contradictory approaches. India must also convincingly demonstrate that the proclivity of many states to use violence to achieve the ends of policy is not a part of India's democratic traditions. Instead, India adheres to a policy of supporting law and seeking reconciliation, ensuring justice. A note on diplomacy. In the same context, and given its growing stature in world affairs, India must act with magnanimity and understanding when certain countries react adversely to India's actions, whether on domestic or international matters. India has a tradition of warm relations with almost all countries, with the exception of Pakistan. It should not now blot this record by acting out of a sense of pique in dealing with certain nations such as Turkey and Malaysia, who have been critical of India's actions in Kashmir and of implicitly siding with Pakistan. Such actions do not sit well with India's hoary traditions and civilizational attributes. The internationalist messenger of peace, who was often the last hope of the world when all machinations had failed and peace looked fragile, was both a recognition of India as well as the heir of Gandhi. This was evident in U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower's letter to Pandit G. April 30, 1958, telling him not to retire as the world needed him. He knew that great fame awaited him but was ready for its travails. In 1937, he reminded himself through his article, "We want no Caesars." But how prophetic his words prove today when he said, he might still use the language and slogans of democracy and socialism, but we all know how fascism has fattened on this language and then cast it away as useless lumber. The decision to cancel the project must be read in the backdrop of the Reddy government maintaining that it doesn't intend to develop Amravati as a world-class city, as Naidu had wanted. Clearly, Reddy is haunted by the specter of Naidu's legacy looming over Amravati. It is not as if Reddy has an alternate plan for the new capital. His vision, unfortunately, seems to be blinded by his obsession with all that Naidu built or proposed. So, bureaucrats have to drive out to meet Reddy in his camp office outside Amravati, instead of the latter receiving them in the CM's chamber in the secretariat built during Naidu's tenure. Elsewhere in Amravati, work has stalled on many infrastructure projects. Funding agencies, including the World Bank and Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, have backed off. With dismal signals being sent out by the government, the city is unlikely to attract any fresh investment, which the state desperately needs. Amravati needs to be built not merely as a legacy project but also to ensure that neighboring Vijayawada is not forced to shoulder the burden of an underdeveloped state capital. Moving beyond Amravati, Reddy's initiatives, such as village secretariats, a parallel bureaucracy of 1.26 lakh new recruits, and the push for retendering old projects, are likely to result in cost overruns and bleed the state economy. The government's lack of a governance plan is compounded by its hostile approach to critics. Government departments have been told to sue the media in the event of reports that officials perceive as defamatory. Reddy needs to realize that governance calls for a more generous vision of both the past and the future. Institutionally, the transition to transparency may not be easy and hinges on the actions of the Chief Justice of India, as administrative head of the court. 8 Chief Justices retired without hearing this difficult case. Even when former CJI Deepak Misra decided that collegium decisions, along with reasons, will be published on the Supreme Court website, CJI Ranjan Gogoi signaled a departure from the practice after 256 decisions were published. Just 2 months ago, when criticized for transferring former Madras High Court Chief Justice V.K. Tahil Ramani to Meghalaya High Court, the collegium headed by CJI Gogoi issued an unusual statement that though it would not be in the interest of the institution to disclose the reasons for transfer, if found necessary, the collegium will have no hesitation in disclosing the same. The reasons never came and Justice Tahil Ramani resigned subsequently. However, the fact that the 5-judge bench comprises of 3 future Chief Justices, N.V. Ramana, Di Chandrachud and Sanjeev Khanna, is reason to hope for a new era of transparency in the Supreme Court. Winning and Losing. By Editorial. November 12, 2019, 2:36 p.m. The Maharashtra and Haryana results, that came just 6 months after the BJP won the general election with an enhanced mandate, are a pointer that no party can claim the permanent loyalty of voters. It is unusual for a pre-poll alliance that won an assembly election to fail in forming the government. That Maharashtra has been placed under president's rule, despite the BJP-Shiv Sena alliance winning a clear majority in last month's assembly election, is an exceptional development. The BJP and Sena have been partners for more than a quarter century, sharing power in local bodies, the state government and at the center. Their relationship was firmed up by their adherence to the ideology of political Hindutva. Now, the two parties have had a seemingly bitter parting, jeopardizing the prospects of a BJP-Sena government in Maharashtra, with the Sena also quitting the NDA. For the BJP, the Maharashtra mess is a moment of reckoning. Among other things, it reveals the predicament of the new BJP, which has been expanding at a furious pace, and has been on a winning spree. For many years, the BJP, despite its ideological character and in contrast to the Congress, was viewed as a party that had the flexibility and skills to stitch coalitions in the most adverse circumstances. Since 1996, when Atal Bihari Vajpayee, after failing to win support for his 13-day government at the center, complained of parties practicing political untouchability, the BJP was seen to have mastered the art of winning allies and running coalition governments. Coalition Dharma was a much-evoked principle in the NDA of Vajpayee and L.K. Advani. However, there is reason to suspect that the party, after its several electoral victories under Narendra Modi and Amit Shah, seems to be losing the ability or willingness to engage with partners and allies. Now the BJP's approach seems to be more intransigent, to emphasize its greater numbers and insist that the regional party lower its expectations. It is curious that the BJP's national leadership refused to intervene in the public spat involving its Maharashtra leaders and the Sena over the Chief Minister's office and ministerial berths. Does it view the Sena's departure as an opportunity to monopolize the entire Hindutva vote in Maharashtra? Or is it an instance of the leadership failing to judge the Sena's intent? Either way, the Maharashtra breakup reflects poorly on the BJP's management of allies, even as anti-BJP ISM may again become the glue that can bring together disparate opposition parties. The Maharashtra and Haryana results, that came just 6 months after the BJP won the general election with an enhanced mandate, are a pointer that no party can claim the permanent loyalty of voters. The federal character of the polity also allows space to regional players, which can scuttle the aims of arrogant or complacent national parties. That may not be a bad thing for democracy. Higher central government spending may have provided some support in the second quarter. Data from the Comptroller General of Accounts shows that government spending, both revenue and capital, picked up pace significantly after the union budget was presented in July. But this is unlikely to have been enough to offset the subdued performance of other sectors. With various high-frequency indicators suggesting that economic activity has slowed down considerably over the past few months, growth may well come in below the psychological 5% mark in the quarter ended September. Equally worrying, even the crutch of government spending will not be available in the coming quarters, as with its own finances coming under pressure, transfers from the Reserve Bank of India can only partially offset the shortfall in both direct and indirect tax collections, and disinvestment receipts remain well below the budgeted target. Cuts in government spending are likely going forward, further accentuating the slowdown. Reflecting this deteriorating economic situation, a few days ago, rating agency Moody's changed its outlook on India's rating from stable to negative, citing increased risks that the country's economic growth will remain materially lower than in the past. It is possible that towards the end of this year the headline growth numbers may pick up once the base effect kicks in. But this is a statistical illusion. It would be a mistake to construe this as a sign of a recovery. The government needs to address multiple issues plaguing the economy. Along with measures to boost long-term potential growth, comprehensive measures are needed to address the stress in specific sectors such as telecom, real estate, and the financial system. Piecemeal solutions are unlikely to lead to sustainable growth. The majority anticipates that similar basic questions on the conflict between individual freedom and constitutionally protected religious beliefs may arise in other situations too. It cites pending petitions concerning the entry of women into a dargah, the entry of Parsi women married to non-Parsis into an agyari, and the practice of female genital mutilation among Dawoodi Bohras. It is shocking that the bench includes the abhorrent practice of female genital mutilation in this genre. It is well established that freedom of religion, under Article 25, is subject to public order, morality and health, and it may not be difficult for any court to test the validity of the practice against the restriction on grounds of a woman's health, and this may not require an exalted panel of 7 judges. In keeping the petitions on Sabarimala pending further, the court has displayed a disquieting inability to stand by its previous transformative judgment. Further, it may lead to a repeat of the unsavory incidents of last year when religious groups and political activists blocked and attacked women devotees. Justices Fali Nariman and D.Y. Chandrachud, in their dissent, rightly call out such transgressions against the rule of law and, while rejecting the need for review, want all authorities to remember their constitutional duty to work in aid of the Supreme Court and the law laid down by it. An omnibus reconsideration of all issues related to religious freedom was not the way out of the serious issues posed by the Sabarimala judgment. The main opinion also argued that information related to issues such as judicial appointments will also be subject to the test of public interest and procedures mandated in the RTI Act that specify that views of third parties, in this case, judges, must be sought. While laying out the importance of the assessment of public interest in any RTI query besides bringing the office of the CJI under the purview of the Act, the decision has gone on to uphold the Delhi High Court verdict in 2010. The RTI Act is a strong weapon that enhances accountability, citizen activism and, consequently, participative democracy, even if its implementation has come under strain in recent years due mainly to the central government's apathy and disregard for the nuts and bolts of the Act. Yet, despite this, the Supreme Court judgment paves the way for greater transparency and could now impinge upon issues such as disclosure, under the RTI Act, by other institutions such as registered political parties. This is vital as political party financing is a murky area today, marked by opacity and exacerbated by the issue of electoral bonds, precluding citizens from being fully informed on sources of party incomes. KC. No, I think when Punjabis meet they always get along. They speak the same language, discuss the same culture, food is the same. The two Punjabs having better connectivity should be a natural outcome. After all, in the past, Punjab was landlocked but connected to Central Asia. During Maharaja Ranjit Singh's time, Lahore was connected by the Indus River, the Sutlej, and had riverine ties with the region. After partition, all of that was delinked. So, Indian Punjab has become completely landlocked and looks at the rest of India for goods and services and markets. There is no cross-border trade left, and so Amritsar, which was on a major trading route to Central Asia, is now completely landlocked, and the same goes for Pakistan's Punjab province too. They are losing their links to the booming economy of India, simply because of their fixation on Kashmir. As we could always enumerate all the many advantages. There are economic and social advantages that would come from better relations between India and Pakistan. The difficulty is that politics always trumps economics. As long as you have this politics of hatred that is entrenched in Pakistan because of a certain religious doctrine, and that seems to be something that is increasingly being seeded in India as well, I don't think one can imagine a very dramatic transformation or a very positive people-to-people relationship between the people of Punjab on this side of the border and people on the other side at present. The inflation data shows that food inflation has jumped to 7.89% in October, up from 5.11% in the previous month, driven by a surge in vegetables prices, especially of onion and tomatoes. This surge is unlikely to subside. Food inflation is likely to remain elevated over the coming months, driving up headline retail inflation. Core inflation, which is essentially inflation excluding food and fuel, has moderated further, however, signaling continued weakness in demand. In its last policy review, the RBI had lowered its estimate for growth this year to 6.1%, down from its earlier assessment of 6.9%. This estimate was based on growth coming in at 5.3% in the second quarter, and ranging between 6.6–7.2% in the second half of the financial year. But there is little possibility of the RBI's projections materializing, as various high-frequency indicators suggest that growth is likely to fall below 5% in the second quarter. Thus, the MPC finds itself in a peculiar position of having to address the growth slowdown while inflation rises. Going by current trends, with little possibility of a meaningful recovery in the near term, the situation warrants further monetary accommodation. So, while the MPC should carefully assess the trajectory of food inflation, its primary concern should be to arrest the slowdown. It should front-load the rate cuts in its December policy, though the magnitude of the cut will depend on the extent to which growth deviates from the RBI's own projection. The shift to external benchmarking should lead to a quicker transmission of the cuts to the broader economy. The first hearing of the impeachment inquiry being conducted by the Intelligence Committee of the U.S. House of Representatives did not go well for President Donald Trump. Two bipartisan career diplomats, the acting U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, William Taylor, and the Deputy Assistant Secretary for European and Eurasian Affairs, George Kent, confirmed that Trump used the authority of his office to further his personal political agenda. In addition, Taylor presented new facts. A staffer from his office witnessed a phone call between Trump and the U.S. ambassador to the EU, Gordon Sondland, where the former inquired about the progress of Ukraine's investigation into alleged corruption by the former vice president and Democratic presidential hopeful, Joe Biden, and his son. Both de jure and de facto, the impeachment proceedings are political. They are carried out by the legislature, and in fact, are unlikely to lead to the president being removed from office, given that Republicans enjoy a majority in the upper house, the Senate, which has the final say. After a whistleblower revealed earlier this year that the U.S. president asked his Ukrainian counterpart Volodymyr Zelensky to investigate Biden on charges of corruption in return for aid in its conflict with Russia, Trump's political rivals seem eager to use impeachment proceedings to embarrass the president ahead of an election year. The efficacy of the tactic, though, is questionable. While opinion polls have indicated that there is growing support for impeachment among Americans, they also suggest that there are a larger number of people who are broadly unhappy with Trump's leadership but do not support impeachment. Will the revelations and the constant attention on alleged misuse of power over the next few months shore up Trump's base and allow him to play the victim vis-a-vis the deep state? Or will they swing those on the fence towards the Democrats? So far, since his campaign in 2016, Trump seems to have been strengthened by scandals, whether over alleged racism, tax evasion, or sexual harassment. There is little doubt that the impeachment proceedings will be at the center of the public conversation in the U.S. till the 2020 elections. But beyond the implications for partisan politics, the hearing this week signaled a disturbing trend. U.S. foreign policy objectives under Trump, it seems, can be all too easily influenced by domestic political vendettas. In the medium and long term, for its own strategic interests as well as stability in international relations, it is important for the U.S. foreign policy establishment to change that perception. One has to admire the deep consideration of the apex advisory body, headed by Vallabhai Kathiria, here. Not only does the proposal take into account the unfulfilled wish of those citizens who have always wanted to nurture the Gau Mata in the city but were intimidated by a lack of infrastructure and support system, it has also kept in mind some of the key issues facing the nation at the moment: a slump in the economy, the state of public education and urban planning, from the perspective of its chief beneficiary. It is, truth be told, a win-win situation. Perhaps there is a lesson or two here for the good people in the Human Resource Development Ministry, whose decision to hike hostel fees and other stipulations at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi met with massive protests this week. A partial rollback has been announced, but one does wonder what it takes to make a case for judicious use of resources to ensure that India's public education system remains robust and equitable. A loud and vociferous move, perhaps. 5-in-1, on BRICS Summit. By Editorial. November 15, 2019, 4:10 p.m. With storm clouds gathering over the world economy, trading arrangements in disarray, and questions over the relevance of the World Trade Organization, WTO, the summit of leaders of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, BRICS, could not have come at a more opportune time. BRICS has proved its naysayers wrong since the idea of grouping the world's 5 emerging economies was coined by a consultant 2 decades ago. BRICS was formed in 2006. India and China have buoyed the grouping with their growth, and even though the idea behind BRICS has been dimmed by sluggish growth in Brazil and South Africa, and Russia's sanction-laden slowdown, the group has adapted to the times and proven its resilience. As a result, even at a time when the 5 countries are heading in different directions politically, they found ways to build a common vision for the world's economic future, with an emphasis on multilateralism and a joint statement at Brasilia that decried unilateral and protectionist actions. For India, in particular, the articulation of this vision comes at an important time, given that it faces its own economic crisis and troubled trading ties with several nations. The failure of officials to resolve issues in time to join the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership (RCEP) had raised questions about whether India is reversing its market liberalization and openness to trade. It is significant that Mr. Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping used the BRICS platform for continued talks on bringing India back into the RCEP fold and focused on resolving their trade issues through the recently launched mechanism led by finance ministers. In their prescriptions, BRICS countries, which acknowledged the weakening of global economic growth in the statement, repeated their commitment to the WTO, though the original promoter of the multilateral structure, the US, is retrenching its interest in the body. They also presented a vision for rules-based, transparent, non-discriminatory, open, free and inclusive international trade, while commending the BRICS-led New Development Bank and the BRICS Business Council in ensuring that BRICS countries, major drivers of growth in the past decade, continue to represent close to a third of global output. Where BRICS has failed its founders is in the vision of interdependence between the 5 countries. Despite their combined population accounting for 40% of humanity, intra-BRICS trade still makes up just 15% of world trade. Going forward, it is greater connectivity and more trade that will allow the BRICS countries to claim their rightful space, and provide the leadership and energy that the global economic order needs urgently. Crossed wires, on telecom industry crisis. By Editorial. November 15, 2019, 4:10 p.m. 2 leading and important players in the telecom industry, Bharti Airtel and Vodafone Idea, have reported historic losses in the second quarter of this fiscal. Vodafone Idea has declared a loss of 50,922 crore rupees, while Bharti Airtel has reported a loss of 22,830 crore rupees. The losses were due to provisions that the 2 companies had to make following an adverse verdict in their Supreme Court battle with the government over the definition of aggregate gross revenue. The 2 companies have also warned that if the government does not offer them relief on the demand to pay arrears of revenue share along with interest and penalty, adding up to about 80,000 crore rupees between them, their very existence as a going concern will be in doubt. In short, what the companies are saying is that they would collapse. Vodafone, in particular, has said that it will have no option but to exit India. It is true that the industry in general, minus Reliance Jio, and Bharti Airtel and Vodafone Idea in particular, are under severe stress and do deserve a helping hand from the government. But the question to ask here is, why did they not provide for the liability in their balance sheets over the years? Conservative accounting demands that contingent liabilities be provided for. The sudden pressure on their financials could have been avoided if they had made a provision in their balance sheet for the liability stemming from a possible adverse verdict in the case. That said, it is clear that it is now time for the government to step in. A committee of secretaries headed by Cabinet Secretary Rajiv Gauba is studying ways in which the telecom industry can be bailed out. While one waits for what this committee will come up with, the fact is that the industry needs another round of reforms right away. The government, which appropriates about 30% of the revenues of each player through various levies and taxes, needs to revisit some of the policies framed by it earlier. The most important issue is addressing the validity of a license fee in the form of revenue share. This was set when spectrum was allotted and not auctioned. With the government now collecting revenues up front in the form of spectrum auction fees, which some feel are unjustifiably high, there is little justification for a license fee as well. There is also the issue of interconnect usage charges to be settled. The telecom regulator is adjudicating this dispute right now. Talking of the regulator, the government also needs to look into the fairness of regulatory policies and approaches and ensure that they are unbiased. The telecom industry is crucial to India's next wave of growth through digitalization, and the government should not be blinded by short-term revenue considerations that imperil long-term prospects. Treating education as a public good. By editorial. November 15, 2019, 4:08 p.m. It is not surprising that Jiddu Krishnamurti, arguably the greatest Indian thinker on education in the 20th century, does not find a mention in the most recent iteration of the New Education Policy, NEP, 2019. Krishnamurti's ideas on education and freedom, learning in a non-competitive and non-hierarchical ecosystem, and discovering one's true passion without any sense of fear, may have been too heterodox for a government report. Nonetheless, there are elements of contemporary global thinking that do inform the NEP. En passant. The emphasis on creativity and critical thinking and the ability to communicate and collaborate across cultural differences, which are part of the global common sense. The near-final NEP, despite its lacunae, is a vast improvement over its earlier, almost unreadable avatar. The report's 55-page brevity is matched by a reader-friendly organizational structure, 4 chapters focusing on school education, higher education, other key areas like adult education, technology and promotion of arts and culture, and a section on making it happen by establishing an apex body and the financial aspects to make quality education affordable for all. While the commitment to double the government expenditure on education from about 10% to 20% over a 10-year period is still insufficient, given the enormity of the challenge, it is an unprecedented commitment to the sector. Education, for most of us, is a necessary public good central to the task of nation building and, like fresh air, is necessary to make our communities come alive. It should not be driven solely by market demand for certain skills, or be distracted by the admittedly disruptive impact, for instance, of artificial intelligence. This form of education should be unshackled from the chains of deprivation, and affordable education, for instance in JNU, is vital to ensure access to even the most marginalized sections of our country. Education policy, in essence, must aim to produce sensitive, creative, and upright citizens who are willing to take the less traveled path and whose professional skills will endure revolutions in thinking and technology. Education is not a commodity. A menu of choices provided by the private sector, which reduces education to the status of a commodity and views our youthful demography as human capital, is being doled out as panacea by instant India specialists to our educational challenges. This is a fallacy. We have to be conscious and deeply aware that there is no developed country where the public sector was not in the vanguard of school and higher education expansion, in ensuring its inclusiveness, and in setting standards. Even the sui generis Ivy League universities, created because of generous philanthropic endowments, function more like public institutions today. It was, therefore, essential for the government to produce a blueprint for reforms after widespread consultation. Whether the present NEP report can deliver on this challenge is debatable. As an academic, I am of course delighted that the NEP's stated goal is to reinstate teachers as the most respected members of our society. Empowerment of teachers remains a key mantra of the policy, and it is understood that this can only be achieved by ensuring their livelihood, respect, dignity, and autonomy, while ensuring quality and accountability. If the NEP stems the rot in most institutions of learning, which leads to the erosion of autonomy of teachers even on academic forums, it would have achieved a major breakthrough. Indeed, such is the intolerant dictatorial attitude of many of our current university leaders that the act of intervening in academic debates itself seems like treason. Equally laudable is the emphasis on early childhood care and schooling more generally. The Anganwadi remain the backbone of an early childhood care system but have suffered on multiple grounds, including lack of facilities and proper training. This, as the report recognizes, needs to change, but the incremental and rather ad hoc changes proposed in standalone Anganwadi. S or Anganwadi. S co-located with primary schools, etc., may not deliver. The idea of volunteer teachers, peer tutoring, rationalization of the system of schools and sharing of resources does sound ominous. It is also not clear what strategies will be adopted, nor what resources will be committed to strengthen the public sector, including the Kendriya Vidyalayas, the state government-run institutions and the municipal schools. Much has to be learned here from examples even in the non-commercial private sector. The best example I know of holistic childhood education is that of Marambika, a free progress, experimental school inspired by the writings of the mother and Sri Aurobindo. The NEP wisely recognizes that a comprehensive liberal arts education will help to develop all capacities of human beings, intellectual, aesthetic, social, physical, emotional, and moral, in an integrated manner. India's past, and its unique, culturally diverse matrix provide a rich framework, but delivering on a holistic liberal education program requires much more than just proclamations. The proposal to establish a national research foundation, with an overarching goal to enable a culture of research to permeate through our universities, needs to be applauded and widely supported. But the creation of a national testing agency, NTA, has understandably generated skepticism. While, on paper, the NTA will serve as a premier, expert, autonomous testing organization to conduct entrance examinations for admissions and fellowships in higher educational institutions, in reality, universities and departments may lose autonomy over admissions, even of research students. This is not an empty fear, the initial signs of this change are already visible in universities. Concern about categorization. Equally serious is the concern about the division between research-intensive premier universities, teaching universities, and colleges. The NEP suggests 3 types of institutions are not in any natural way a sharp, exclusionary categorization, but are along a continuum. But the advantage of these divisions, per se, is neither intuitively nor analytically clear, given that high-quality teaching and cutting-edge research comfortably coexist in most universities of excellence. The NEP draft will now be placed before the Cabinet. One hopes that many of the concerns raised are addressed before an official policy is finally announced, recognizing also the enormous pressure from global educational service providers to capture the Indian education market. In 2003, I had the opportunity, as Vice Chancellor of the University of Jammu, to invite the then Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, RSS Chief K.S. Sudarshan for breakfast at home. Also invited were my colleagues in the university, K.L. Bhatia and Nirmal Singh. Addressing the issue of a section of Jammu chauvinists campaigning against my appointment as a Kashmiri to the vice-chancellorship, Sudarshan said, "This is a Vishwavidyalaya university, an academic universe, a global sanctuary of ideas which we can never be reduced to a space for narrow bigotry. We have to upload the highest principles here, not let academic positions or programs be traded or let education become yet another business." Given that the RSS is an important stakeholder in the NEP, it is critical that it guards against consumerist, neoliberal ideas of education taking over through the back door, while an apparent vigil of cultural nationalism is maintained in the front. Amitabh Madhu is professor at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. The court has been inconsistent in applying the essential religious practice doctrine that it evolved in the 1950s. Perhaps that is just as it should be. It may be that the court's push for expanding its remit and for hard clarity on complex questions is misguided and counterproductive. In some cases, it is okay, even just to keep to the narrow path, take it case by case. In various periods in India's history, the university has been a contested space. There are now, in India's public universities, a plethora of voices from hitherto marginalized groups that often make the powers that be uncomfortable. Students have by and large demanded that the university become a more egalitarian space, in terms of representation, access and protocols and practices in hostels. To insist that people from a particular religion not be allowed into a department of one of India's most prestigious universities is a demand to make it a space more regressive than society at large, not less. Hopefully, the students and scholars at the Sanskrit department will soon course correct. Born to a family of modest means in Basantpur village in Bihar's Ara district, Singh acquired a reputation for quizzing his mathematics teachers at school. Patna University decided to bend its rulers when it was felt that the syllabus system was holding the prodigy back. Singh was allowed to appear for the final year BSc examination when he was still in his first year. He topped The American sojourn followed soon after. After his PhD, Singh worked at NASA for about 3 years. His research has applications in areas ranging from computer graphics to quantum mechanics. Singh chose to return to India at the height of his scholastic prowess and worked at the IIT Kanpur, TIFR, Mumbai and the ISI, Kolkata. But his mind had also begun wandering into realms unknown. In 1976, not yet 35, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. He is known to have scribbled equations in notebooks that admirers would get for him, which would be kept under lock and key. Are there traces of his erudition waiting to be uncovered?